My name is Elis Vibacke, and I am the Vice President of the Stockholm University Student Union. I will talk a bit about student governance, student power aspects of COVID-19. So my presentation is called 2020, a turning point for student governance, and that refers to the Swedish experience of how COVID-19 has affected student governance and students' right to participation in the decision-making process at the university. So I will start with a bit of background. The students' right to participation has very strong support in the Swedish law, because according to Swedish law, every university needs to have at least one student union. And the main purpose of a student union, according to the law, is to monitor and participate in the education, but also the study conditions for students at the university in a very broad sense. So that means that the student union elects student representatives to all bodies at the university that concern students. And this means both decision-making bodies and also preparatory bodies, and also bodies at the administrative side of the university. So usually Swedish student unions are very involved in the process when things that concern students are discussed. And this has quite a bit of history. It has, of course, not always been like this, but in the 1960s, in Sweden, like all over the world, the number of students increased very rapidly, and there were many calls for a democratization of higher education. So at some universities like Uppsala, for example, which is the oldest university in Sweden, they started experimenting with student representation. And then in the 1970s, the structure of higher education changed and student representatives became more common. So the current laws that regard student governance in Sweden are from the 1990s, the early 90s. And then there is also a specific law about student unions from 2009. And these give powers to the student unions that universities cannot ignore. They have to accept student representation, which is a strong support for student rights. However, I will talk now a bit about Stockholm University, where I come from. Stockholm University is the biggest university in Sweden, if you count the number of registered students each semester. And there are about 30,000 students at Stockholm University right now. And this also means that the Stockholm University Student Union is the biggest student union in Sweden, both when you look at the number of students we represent, because we represent every student at university, but also if you count the number of members that have chosen to become members in the union, with about 13,000 members last year. And as I said, the student union is usually very highly involved in the decision-making process at the university. We have hundreds of student representatives at all levels, both locally on department and faculty levels, but also on central level. And this is not only according to the law, but also according with the university's own rules. Then, of course, COVID-19 happened, and that is, of course, the focus of this conference. In Sweden, everything changed in around March 2020. One of the first confirmed COVID-19 cases in Sweden was actually a student at Stockholm University. And then the number of cases have risen. And there are about, I think, 5,000 deaths at the moment in all of Sweden. And on the 17th of March, the Swedish government called for all universities and also high schools to move all their courses online. So no more face-to-face education, but only online education. And the same day, Stockholm University announced that they chose to almost completely shut down the Stockholm University campus. Of course, they had to move the education online, but they didn't have to close all facilities, but they chose to do so. So almost all facilities and buildings at the university campus were locked for students and were completely locked until just a few weeks ago. So this means that all students have to work from home, and they couldn't use the usual quiet places to study at the university, for example. And since Sweden didn't have a full-scale lockdown like many other European countries, this decision was not made by the government, but by the university itself. And when we look at the student governance structure, as I said, usually students are always involved in decisions that affect students in one way or another. But the decision to lock all university facilities was taken without student involvement during an evening. And of course, the university needed to act quickly. This probably found a very logical decision. But as I said, students were not involved in a very huge decision that affected them. And student representatives have still not been invited to the central group for crisis management at the university, despite that group obviously also affecting students very much. But there has, of course, been a friendly dialogue between the student union and the university, and students have been involved in a number of decisions that regard COVID-19, but not the most important, biggest ones. And this sets Stockholm University apart from other universities in Sweden. For example, in Uppsala, as I mentioned earlier, their buildings at campus remained open during the whole spring semester. Because in Sweden, March is like in the middle of semester, so the spring semester continued for another few months. And at some universities also the students were involved in the central crisis management group. So I had a Mentimeter question, but I think I will skip this actually, because we have been going on for over 7 hours, and we have still some few speakers to go. And I think we've already answered these questions, because the question was, have student representatives been involved in the decision-making process at your university or college during the pandemic? And I think from all the previous presentations that it's been quite clear that you have been involved in some way or another. But we can, of course, discuss this further after my presentation if you want. So to say a few words also about how this affected how news about the pandemic were delivered at the university. In the beginning, the student union received much information from the communications managers about what the university decisions regarding the pandemic meant for students. For example, the decisions to lock the university buildings and not have the study places open. And then, of course, the student union could forward this information to the students as well. But the information from at least the communications department has not been improved. It's rather stopped, actually. The students have many contacts with the university and their specific departments in other ways. And the university has been informing students on their websites about the changes, and they have updated the website continually. However, many students that are concerned about what this means for them, and especially international students who needs to have campus education really to get to keep their visa and stuff like that. They have asked the student union for information and for help, and of course it's difficult for the student union to help everyone and be a true representative of all students if we are not included in all the decision-making bodies and don't have access to all the information. So I had another question as well, and that was how was the communication between your university or college and the different student organizations. Another question is what happens now, because as I said, during the spring semester everything was closed down and the classes were taught online. But now the autumn semester in Sweden has just started. It started this Monday, so the semester has been going on for a week. And Stockholm University has started to open up again. This autumn, most courses will still be online, but some departments are back at campus. Like we heard before, some courses that need access to laboratories, for example, they have had some special access to the university, and some introduction sessions have been held at campus as well. But and the facilities are open, so the library have kind of their normal opening hours, and some of the study places have opened, but not all for safety reasons. So campus is open, but most courses are still online. However, some restaurants are reopening and stuff like that. But to get to campus, most students use public transportation, which of course is not ideal for students in high-risk groups, for example, because even if you practice social distancing at campus or at home, the way between your home and campus can be very crowded if you take a bus or a metro. Then the student union has its own student newspaper called Studietid, which is of course monitoring the situation very closely. And Studietid was a completely digital project already before the pandemic, so they have been able to continue with their digital reports about what's going on at the university and how that affects students and so on. So that was a bit about the situation at Stockholm University and some thoughts about the future, because as I said, Sweden has a very strong tradition of student governance, and it's inscribed in the law and usually very respected. But did COVID-19 fundamentally change the perception of student governance at Stockholm University? I think that's something you have to ask. And what will happen when the next crisis strikes? Because if there's a similar pandemic type of crisis that means that university will close down or the facilities will get locked or so on, how will students be involved then? Because even if it was probably the right decisions that were made, students were not actively involved in them. And that, of course, can affect how the validity of the crisis management at the university. So that was a few thoughts. I'd try to keep this short because we have some speakers left, but I will gladly answer questions or hear your thoughts about what I said. So I open up for questions now.